Hi guys, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. It has been too long since I've done a book talk video and I miss them and I want to do one right now. I've got a bunch of tearjerker stories about world wars, which, you know, how fun is that to read about? But this is what I read about. I love history books and historical fiction, so this is what I share. So in teaching English and history really, a lot of what we do in teaching these days is like create text sets. So rather than just read one piece or like one novel, we bring in other sources to kind of surround it and give us a bigger picture of an event or a time period or whatever. So that's kind of what I do for myself as well. So the book that I'm going to start with, this is the first one that I read. This is by Kristen Hanna. It's called The Nightingale. I absolutely love this book. I got this at the book fair. I took my kids to the Scholastic Book Fair and I was walking around and I saw this one. It's definitely more of an adult book. I think this is something that I really would have enjoyed when I was like in high school as well, because it's about World War II and I was really fascinated by that time period when I was younger, and I still am. This is one of my favorite books that I've ever read. This is historical fiction, but it's based on a lot of research, and while the characters are technically fictional, it's very likely that, you know, somebody would have gone through their almost exact experiences. So this is about two sisters who live in France during the German occupation. So Nazis occupy their little city, and this really gets into like the social history of the women who were left behind at that time, because so many of the men went off to war during World War II, but then the Nazis came in and occupied France, and it was really just women there, and it was women who had to like preserve their homes, they had to try and preserve their culture, they had to try and preserve their morality and their sense of right and wrong. They even had to try and preserve their neighbors who were maybe considered undesirable by the Nazis. So in this book there are two sisters. One of them is single and she's like very adventurous, and she wants to go off and find a way to fight the Nazis herself. So she is involved in helping soldiers escape into safer places, territories. So one thing that actually I loved about this book, I was like, oh hey, is it goes into how the Basque people supported the Allied effort, and I like am obsessed with Basque people. We had Basque foreign exchange students when I was in high school, and I remained friends with them for a long time. I've been to the Basque country. I considered getting my PhD in Basque studies at the University of Nevada, Reno. So anytime that I read about Basque people, I'm like, ah. So that was really enjoyable for me. I loved her thread of the story. And then her sister, her husband has gone off to war and they have a daughter, and she's just trying to maintain their house. She's actually a teacher. And so Nazis came in and would just reside in these homes. They would just pick one, maybe based on how pretty the wife was that lived there or how nice the house was, and they would just move in, and you had to cook for them and clean for them. And so this is really the story of everything that the women had to do. It's very little about the French soldiers. There is quite a bit in here about the Nazi soldiers, and these are just these things that sometimes in like a history class you don't have time to study, but it's so important to kind of immerse yourself in the day-to-day realities of these women that were left behind essentially, and they were starving to death. There were like rations, they had to go stand in line for food, but the Nazis had all the food in the world and they would bring it into these homes. And so it would have been difficult for these women, because if you kind of cooperated with the Nazis and acquiesced to them a little bit, you might be able to get more food for your kids. But most of them didn't want to cooperate with the Nazis, but you couldn't outright defy them because you could be putting your life in danger, your kids' lives in danger. So there's just such a tension in this house. You know, how can this woman like maintain her integrity without getting herself killed or without getting her daughter killed? And I can't imagine how difficult that would have been. And there are many horrible things that happen in this story, and I think for students who want to read about those things, I understand that. something that I would have wanted to do. There is a scene where a rape occurs, and it is not glorified in any way. It does, it's not gratuitous. Like, I think that it does fit within the story, and it's probably something that was incredibly common, though still incredibly hurtful. And so you've got to be a little bit careful with who reads this book, but I don't think that that like negates it, because there are lots of horrible things that were happening in this book. Like, everything that the Nazis do was completely inappropriate and completely evil. So this is just, it's heartbreaking, but you learn a lot about World War II from it, and it's just one of my new favorite books, to be honest. I talked about it a lot on Insta stories as I was reading it, and then people suggested this one, which is also by Kristen Hanna. It's called The Winter Garden. So this one, from the description, sounded so fascinating because it's about a woman who lived through World War II in Russia, and that just intrigued me. I definitely had like an appetite for these stories about like the social history of women during war. So I was so excited to read this book. It disappointed me a little bit, I'm not gonna lie, because the majority of it is just about that woman's daughters who live like in the present day in Washington, I think. And I just didn't care about their stories at all. Like, it goes into their personal lives and stuff, and I just didn't care. All I wanted to read about was the mother and her experiences in Russia. And it seems like for Kristen Hanna, this was a much more difficult story to research than the Nightingale, and she was able to find a lot more sources and then, you know, set more of this in France than this one. But I would have read a shorter book just about the mom in Russia. So, I mean, it's good. I still read it just, you know, within a couple of days, because the whole time I was like, okay, when is the mom gonna talk? I want the mom here. And what she goes through, oh my goodness. I mean, quite similar to the Nightingale, but colder, more snow, more misery. I would still suggest this one, especially if you just like more typical stories and you like reading about characters and you like plot and character development, where I'm just more like, give me the facts, man. I just want the history. So I liked this. Now I really want to read more about the social history of Russia during World War II. So if you know any more books like this, please recommend them down below. So the next one that I got at the book fair is called Dead Wake by Erik Larson, and this one's actually about World War I, but again, it's very much a social history, and this one is not as plot driven. He even says in the beginning that this is not considered a work of fiction. This is a history book. It's really not like a monograph, because he doesn't have an argument really, or like a thesis that he's proving throughout the book. He's just telling us the story of the last crossing of the Lusitania. I'm actually not quite done with it, but I mean, we all know how it ends, but I'm right here on page 223 out of 353. So I'm a little ways out, but I just wanted to talk about it because it is so fascinating. It's not quite as quick of a read as the other two because it doesn't really have that plot driving you forward, but I like the structure of this book. The way that he does it, I need like my hands to show you. So there are two stories kind of happening simultaneously. So you've got all of the people boarding the Lusitania in New York, and then you kind of have like the stories of them crossing the ocean. And then at the same time, you have stories of the U-boats and the Germans and submarine warfare, and that's kind of going this way, and he kind of jumps back and forth between the two stories, but they're like moving towards each other. So where I'm at right now, we are almost reaching the climax where they are going to collide, quite literally. So more and more tension is building as you come to that point. So it is really interesting. It does kind of pull you forward, but it's a slower read because it's so rich in details. I love how Erik Larson writes. I love his use of details, and this is how I like to write as a historian as well. I really like finding like obscure details and working them in, like even if you go over your page count or whatever, you want to include those things that make people human. So I can just picture, like I feel like I can kind of read between the lines of his book, and I can see his research, I can see his office and the different files on different people that he has, and like his little post-it notes and those little details that he wants to work into the story. There's not really like one main character that he talks about on the Lusitania, but he jumps back and forth between different people in like first class and second class and the captain, and so these are based on historical records and letters and newspaper articles and all these things that he's cobbled together to put together this more cohesive story, and it's really interesting. He also talks quite a bit about Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, so this is before the United States has entered World War I, and all these things I did not know about President Wilson. So his wife died while he was in office. I didn't realize that, and it like destroyed him. But then he meets this other woman and he wants to marry her. He falls in love with her. At the point that I'm at, she has rebuffed him and she doesn't want to marry him. So he's going through all this stuff in his personal life, and there's a lot of pressure to figure out what to do in regards to World War I, and should the United States stay neutral, or what should happen. So this is really interesting for me because this is right around the time period that I studied for my master's, like the 19-teens. Of course, I was looking at the Virgin Islands, but that is incredibly connected to World War I and sea warfare and all of these things. So, oh, that's the other really interesting thing about this is as I learned more about like submarine warfare, it just reminds me how different like the setting of fighting in World War I was. I mean, World War I was so expansive. It included practically the whole world, but most of the spaces where people fought were so tiny and so compact. So when you think of World War I, you usually think of like the trenches and the no man's land, and these, like everything you read about World War I is just so miserable. They had these muddy trenches and their feet would get infected and people would die and just lie in the trench, and you just have these stalemates because nobody wants to get out and rush toward each other and fight. So like that space of fighting was horrible. But then the submarines, and this was, you know, new to warfare in World War I, they were also pretty miserable. I hadn't thought much about that before, but they are also very confined, very stuffy. It smells like gas all the time. They're hot and sweaty and stinky. You don't have much visibility. You can't really see who you're fighting. And so it talks about, you know, when they would shoot torpedoes at these ships, they could see like through the periscope, but your vision was limited and you couldn't really hear what was happening. So you would just shoot this torpedo that killed hundreds of people, and then you're just kind of sitting there like maybe continuing your card game or whatever. So the style of fighting in World War I is just so strange, and this is what kind of pushes us towards like modern warfare. We're very removed from some of the fighting today as well, and like in World War II, that's when we really bring in fighting from the air and dropping bombs, and so that's not really what the book is about, but it's just interesting to see that progression and kind of like the distance that we have developed from killing people. I don't know, it's very interesting to me. So even though I haven't finished this book yet, I love it. This is definitely something that I'm going to refer back to. And there's a lot of context in this book. I kind of tabbed a few pages where it talked about what people were actually reading at that time and what they were thinking about. It reminded me to read The Yellow Wallpaper. I read it back in like early college, and I've wanted to read it again since then. This is just the kind of history book that I love. I would recommend this if you are a history student currently and you want to see an example of good historical writing that's not boring. This is what you should read. Okay, I have one more to show you. This one I have not read, but a lot of people recommended All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. So this one apparently is quite similar to The Nightingale, which I loved so much. This one takes place in Paris, which is also Nazi occupied, and I really can't wait to start this one. I'm gonna wait until I finish Dead Wake. This is kind of like my reward book for finishing this one. Since this one is so much more of a history book, my reward will be to read an actual novel. The reviews on this one were just absolutely amazing. I think they might have made this into a movie. I haven't gone to the movies in so long because we have a baby. So I don't even know what's happening in the movie world, but this one really looks good. So if you've read this one, let me know down below how you liked it. So if you have any suggestions for me, let me know down below. I like historical fiction that's really heavy on the historical and less heavy on the fiction. So I feel like after I read that last one, I'll be pretty set on my like World War I, World War II history, and I want to look at something like completely different, like in a completely different setting or a completely different time and era. So what do you think I should read about next? I need some suggestions, and then I will do another book talk for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!